So when I think we're on. So when I say tables, I don't mean coding. I mean literal tables.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how awful is my audio quality?
You sound okay.
Good.
Right. Okay, so yeah, tables. Oh, we lost Gus. Oh, we always lose Gus. Yeah, by tables we mean tables, furniture. So we have a couple of newcomers and we have some people I've never met before. So I just want to say welcome to everybody. And we're talking about chapter 2 in Russell's Problems of Philosophy book. Uh-oh. And let me just mute that. So in chapter 1, he promised us that he would give us all kinds of arguments and good reasons to believe that the external world really exists, and that there was no reason to think the external world didn't exist. And then you get his reasons in chapter 2. And I don't know about you guys, I was very disappointed. What are other people's impressions of his reasons?
Yeah, I mean, he certainly was honest about it and came clear in that you have to assume and make the presupposition that it exists, and then it makes sense. And in fact, it not only makes sense, it becomes the simplest explanation.
Right. He says it's the simplest explanation. Right. So just real quick in chapter 2, he's sort of presents everything and says, "Oh, okay, this is the chapter where I explain why we have every reason to believe there's an external world and no good reason to believe there's not an external world." He talks about Descartes and says that, you know, the solid basis is going to be our own internal experiences. And then I think the next thing he does is go, well, kind of takes a common sense approach and says, well, we have other people who see experiences that, or have experiences that seem to indicate that they're the same as ours. So that's something. But then he immediately says, no, that's not anything, because the other people, to me, are also sense data. So that would be circular to try to appeal to other people. And then he admits, right, there's no logical impossibility in supposing that I'm the only thing that exists, and all the objects, all these external world objects that seem to come before me are my own mental creations. And then after that, he just insists. He says, well, okay, it's not impossible, but there's no reason to suppose it's true. Then he says, well, the more simple view is this common sense view. So to me, it seems like he's sort of just insisting that it's more simple. Now, he does give his cat example to support this claim that that it is more simple is easily seen. So you guys remember the cat example?
Go ahead.
I'm a newbie to whatever you guys are talking about. I haven't seen the first part of anything. Just speaking because we're live now, or I'm just saying this because we're live now. So I have no idea what she's talking about.
Okay, so the cat. There are changes in the cat from the different times that I look at the cat. So, for example, it changes location from one place to another. It seems to be hungry sometimes.
Doesn't that assume the cat exists?
It assumes the cat exists. And the point is that these changes in the cat are more difficult to explain if we don't suppose that there's a real physical world with a persistent cat in it, and that it's just more simple to go ahead and suppose it.
But isn't there persistent cats in? Sorry, go ahead. I'm just going to say, isn't there persistent cats in a matrix world? Isn't there persistent cats in a matrix world with changes?
Well, yeah. So if it's all a dream, or if we're all in the matrix, there could still be persistent cats.
Yes.
So I don't know about this argument.
Well, he then goes on to say, you know, for this cat example is a relatively simple one because we could just say that it's a matrix thing. But then when we take the example of humans, it becomes much more complex. And so when we come to explaining, things like the utterance of concepts, which we recognize that if we make those same sounds, that they have some meaning and concept, then that's much harder to explain than just the mere existence of a cat.
Why? Those would exist in a matrix world as well.
The only thing I'd like to throw in, having only just sort of joined this conversation, is that to me it seems meaningless as to whether or not there is any sort of external reality versus consistent model of reality, sort of like the Matrix, generated entirely in one brain, floating in the actual reality of a vast empty universe. It seems to make no real difference to me, especially if you cannot escape this reality in any form, unlike the Matrix.
It's not about whether
I don't see why not play by this universe's rules, regardless of whether or not it's external or internal only.
It's not a matter. It doesn't matter whether it makes an impact for you or there's any difference. It's a matter of whether what's the truth of the matter. It's not about what impact it has. It's not about pragmatism. It's about what's just the truth of the matter.
But I mean to how you conduct things philosophically and how you reason things, not just what it pragmatically affects life.
Right. So I think I might agree that it really doesn't make any difference so long as it's consistent, right? That is probably okay. But what we're talking about here is he's claiming in this chapter that he's giving all his good reasons for why the truth of the matter is that there's an external world. And so we kind of want to talk about that. And then the last thing he says, and I just have to get this out because I want to see what you guys think about this. It seems to me the last thing he says is he just sort of straight up appeals to intuition.
And that's
now,
good.
He does say it's a shared intuition. We all have this intuition. We all sort of come instinctively to believe that there really is this external world. And the reason that we've been doubting it is just because of arguments. And so he makes this preference of instinct over argument by sort of just declaring it as a preference that we all ought to have and hold.
The only way to make that argument is to presuppose an external reality that follows behaviors and includes other humans who have these behaviors.
Right. So I think going back to the cat thing, what we're saying is, you know, I have to imagine a cat, and B, that it has these states of hungriness and movement, etc., etc. And that's, you know, gets more and more complicated the more things the cat does. Okay.
That doesn't matter.
Or I could just attribute this to a cat, and then I don't have to attribute the states of the cat. The cat has its own states, which change position and temperament. And that problem becomes more complex when you get to humans.
If you remember the Matrix, movie, in what he would be calling the real external world, there's a scene in the Matrix movie when the guy who betrays everyone, you see him setting it all up, and he's sitting having lunch. It's not really lunch, it's just illusory. And he says, you know this piece of steak? I know this piece of steak doesn't exist. I know this. So, but that's supposed to be in the real world. And that's imaginary, that's illusory. But in the actual real world, you have people eating food, you have cats, you have people, you have words, you have concepts. All of that's in the real world, but it ain't this world.
Right.
Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen the original Matrix.
So, yeah, so I think, you know, that compounding of complexity, which is a way of saying it, maybe, I don't know whether that's the right way. I think that's what he's aiming for, to say it's simpler to, you know, attribute these things to the real world than it is to try and construct the Matrix.
What real world are you referring to?
To the external world, which is assumed. The cat, in this case, or the table.
You can't call that the real world. You can call that the assumed world.
Okay, the assumed world, yeah. So if we assume the world to be real, then this idea of simplicity and complexity becomes more persuasive, I think.
Why? That simplicity and complexity exists in the matrix. In fact, that simplicity and complexity exists if you're dreaming.
Sure. So I have
to think about this.
So I have to keep
about this
ideas.
Did you finish the chapter, Matt? Did you read on? Did you finish the whole thing?
No, obviously not. We're only doing chapter 2, right?
Chapter 2, yeah.
Yeah, we're doing chapter 2, and
chapter 2.
Yep, and I think we've all read it, or we're caught up enough anyway, right?
Okay. So
I'd like to throw in a thought.
Hang on a second before you do. Do others think that that's roughly the ballpark of where he was getting to with the complexity? The idea of saying, look, I have to imagine so much more, so many more assumptions than if I just assume it's a real world. Is that where he's going? And that's why it's a simpler explanation to assume a real world than it is to say that I'm in some kind of matrix making all of this stuff up myself.
I think that's right.
I think that's what he's saying, but do we agree? Is it really simpler?
Yeah, he's making. First of all, he's making an appeal to Occam's razor, right? You have two hypotheses that. You have two hypotheses, hypothesis A and hypothesis B, and you can't separate them with the evidence. So because you can't separate them with the evidence, you invoke Occam's razor, and you go with the option that postulates less entities to explain the same phenomena. That's what he's going with, right?
He also invokes the concept of a miracle, in that he's saying that he uses the table for an example and says, are these material objects just our sense data? And if they're just our sense data, when we put a tablecloth over the table, all of a sudden the table should no longer exist because there's no sense data of the table. So this tablecloth would be suspended in midair, so to speak, by some miracle. And so he's saying that becomes inexplicable. And so if we assume that there is this material world out there that isn't merely just our sense data, we have a more parsimonious view. All of a sudden, things are better explained, whereas we're left with these inexplicable phenomena if we assume that the world is just our sense data.
I disagree.
But what you said doesn't follow.
Hypothetically, our brains could just be generating a very consistent model of the world. As opposed to object permanence not existing, our brains could just generally be very good at getting an idea of how things work. Not to mention that if you have a cloth over the table, it could just still be the way that it interacts in this mental reality, that the table still sort of exists, but it's only in a state where it is able to hold up the cloth. I mean, for example, if you have a really thin cloth through the cloth, the table would still exist in some sense. Our brains don't have to create. We don't have any reason to think that our brains would necessarily have to create a completely incoherent reality in order for it to be generated only in our brains.
You keep referring to the brain. The brain is a material thing, so the whole discussion here is about the actuality of material things or not. You can't make reference to the brain as if it's some sort of a special case. It's not a special case. Whether the brain exists is whether a material things exist. So I don't know why you
mind
right. It's just the circulars appealing to other people.
Yeah. And the other thing is,
Russell's very careful to start this off in the way that he does. He starts with sense data.
Hold on, let's have Matt go, and then Shadow, you go after that. Go ahead, Matt. I think something new, Shadow.
The other thing is, what he said about the tablecloth just doesn't follow. What if the tablecloth was transparent? So you could put a transparent tablecloth over the table, and you would have the tablecloth sense data, and you would have the table sense data. Both would exist. No miracle. It's only if you put a cloth over the table that's not transparent that the sense data stuff would come into play.
So I think the purpose of the tablecloth is just to isolate your sense data from it, to say that if we're going to assume that the world is just a collection of our sense data, then we have these seemingly absurd implications from that. But then he one of the most important lines that he has in this chapter is, this seems plainly absurd, but whoever wishes to become a philosopher must learn not to be frightened by absurdities. And so I guess I kind of have a leg up in that I've read this work from start to finish. One of the things that he's doing is he's starting in the tradition of Descartes. So he first in chapter 1 distinguishes between appearance and reality. And now he's trying to find a solid basis for our knowledge, which is what Descartes did with his systematic doubt. And even then he doubts that further. He goes, even Descartes got it wrong because he assumed a self. He assumed a continuous I or me. And so he's starting from the position of, the only thing I can be absolutely certain of is the sense data that I'm getting in. So he's in subsequent chapters, you're going to see that these assumptions that we take on are very difficult to give arguments for, and that the arguments that we can give are flimsy, and that these absurd implications may not necessarily be good reasons to reject.
Okay. And what gives you the certainty about sense data?
Well, because he's saying, so he starts with Descartes' cogito and says that there is thinking going on. And so that if you start with the proposition that there is thinking going on, that's not something that you can coherently doubt. So if I were to say
that's what I was going to say, is that I don't know how to doubt my existence or the fact that I'm processing information and thinking and all that.
Well, so you could doubt, like the Buddhists do, that there's no continuous self it seems like I am the same person that I was yesterday, and I will be the same person that wakes up tomorrow. But Russell points out that even that could be doubted. So really what we should take the cogito to start off with is, there is thinking going on.
Cogito.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I thought it was hard G, not soft G.
I'm not sure where you answered my question there.
What was your question again? I apologize.
I'll answer it.
You said earlier that he gets his he says the only thing we can be certain of is our sense data, and I'm asking the question, from where does he derive the certainty about sense data?
Well, because you can't coherently doubt that so I could say that I have a sense data of a ghost, and then we could say that, look, there isn't really something that corresponds to that sense data. I can doubt that ghost is real, but I can't doubt the sense data that's coming into me, because I'm experiencing that directly. And so if I say that there is no sense data coming in,
there's absolutely no reason to believe that your sense data coming in is illusory.
But what would prevent it being illusory?
So it's irrelevant whether it's illusory or not. The fact is, you're still getting the sense data.
Well,
so you can then ask the question,
wait a minute.
Is the sense data correspond to something in reality, or is it merely an illusion?
There's so many assumptions going on there. And first of all, all you can say is thinking is going on and something is thinking it. You can't divide that into persons. No, if solipsism is a case. Okay,
you're right. You're absolutely right. That you can't divide this into persons. You can doubt that. So again, we're looking for a solid foundation to begin with our knowledge. And so the only thing that you can say is, there is thinking going on, or there is sense data. You couldn't say whose sense data that is.
But by sense data,
the sense data
thinking, right?
The sense data that I'm experiencing, the thinking that I'm experiencing, that I would classify, again, I say I kind of can't not do that because English. I would say that is me, that I can separate me from the thinking, the thing that looks like thinking coming from other beings. That could be illusory, but I am certain that I am thinking and processing.
And so
that's not true. That's cogito. That's what Russell is arguing against, right? He's arguing against the cogito.
Yeah,
he's not arguing against the cogito. He's just challenging. He's saying that, look, Descartes didn't go far enough. So he's saying that in our pursuit for trying to find the ground of where we can start with something that's absolutely certain, we can still go further than Descartes did. That's the point
Simon.
I take away from it.
Well, I thought Russell was a little unclear about what he meant by sense data, because I didn't take it to be just the photon, for instance, just the photons entering the eye. I took it to be, you know, an interpretation of that data.
Yeah, usually, and I think Russell might be being vague on purpose about that, because I think
he is,
yeah,
because he's going to build on this. There's a chapter on idealism.
You see the sense data as being on the inside, you know, in your mind.
Subjective.
But I think typically, at least nowadays, sense data are in the mind.
Yes, they're subjective. So this we could get into consciousness here, where there's this irreducibly subjective first-person character to our sense data, and so that's the thing. That's what he thinks that we can't coherently doubt.
But just to be clear, by sense data, we're not talking about the 5 physical senses, because that would assume physicality, right?
No, well, it is talking about the 5 physical senses, but
then he's begging the question of physicality when that's.
But he's not assuming physicality per se. He's saying, is there some physical world that is making an impression on us and causing us to have this sense data?
But the sense data is physical. That's like asking the question.
Well, he's not assuming sense data itself is physical.
Let me ask the question.
Hold on, let's let Matt finish, because this is something I was wondering about too.
So if you're asking the question, is there a physical world out there, then you've got this stuff presenting itself to a physical. No, you can't do that. That's assuming.
Why not?
Because that's assuming the physical exists in order to demonstrate or talk about whether the physical exists or not. You can't use anything physical.
He's not claiming that sense data are physical.
That's what I was saying. So your senses are physical, right?
No, not necessarily.
That is the conclusion that we drawn, or perhaps the assumption. I don't know how this conversation is going to go, but right now we all agree. Although we're arguing about whether or not we can justify it, but we all do agree that sense data comes from a physical experience, a physical.
I might have misunderstood your question, because I thought your question was, are we talking about the 5 senses? Which, of course, our sense data is what we're getting from those 5 senses. But now that's not to assume a physical world.
Well, yeah, I mean, you touch is one of the senses, right? You touch with what? Physical organs, right?
Well, you don't know.
Smell is done by the nose.
Another famous argument from around this time from G.E. Moore, where he says, "Look, I have hands." He's like, "What could be more obvious than the fact that I have hands? I can see my hands."
That's just a bad argument. Okay, that's assuming the reliability of the senses in order to try and demonstrate the reliability of the senses.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I mean, that's a misstep.
Right. You guys know about phantom arm syndrome or something? People who have lost limbs but can still feel those limbs.
Yeah, that's a great example, because so you have this sense data of something that you feel like is an arm, but maybe you don't have these limbs, and that these are just phantom limbs, and that so these are ways that we can coherently doubt the material world. Keep in mind that the second chapter is all about the material world, and can we move from our sense data to a material world?
But the sense data is part of the material world. Unless that's
begging the question. To say that the sense data is part of the material world, that begs the question.
Hold on.
That's why I asked the question whether it was physical or not, and the answer I got back was yes. So it's not begging the question. It's going to
Okay, hold on. So the sense data are not supposed to be physical.
That's what I was asking.
Right. So and does anybody think that they be, or that they are, or that we should think of them as being physical?
So we can't.
How come?
So it's a question. So Russell's posing a question. We have this sense data that we can't doubt. We don't know if it's physical or not, and we don't know if it corresponds to something material out in the world. That's the question. That's the question that's being posed.
And where does he think this sense data is coming from?
That's the question.
What's delivering that?
Is it coming from something? Is it something external in the world making an impression on our sense data, or is it all illusory? Is it all a projection of our mind.
Cool. So the sense data is just the data.
No reason to believe that.
Real quick.
So the sense data then is consistent with a matrix world and also external physical reality.
Yes, because even in a matrix world, I would be getting sense data. It's just the computer would be manipulating my sense data.
Yes, something's getting sense data, but we don't have any way to argue for what it is.
Indeed.
Well, he's trying to find a way to.
Are you denying
in chapter 2? He provides no reason.
Are you denying the existence of the physical world, Matt?
So
anyway, no, I assume the existence of the physical world. I assume it. I can't demonstrate it to be the case. I assume it.
Okay, so what is basically? Let's move on a little bit because we've gone.
Russell said there wasn't absolute certainty.
Yeah. So Russell is also saying we have to suppose the existence of the physical world.
At bottom.
Why?
And he's offering
That's not
two.
Exactly right. Because again, a few chapters from now, he's going to talk about idealism.
Oh.
Yeah, but we're on chapter 2, right?
We're on chapter 2.
If you go ahead, you're just
that's why I kind of have an advantage here in having read this work. Is I know that what he's setting this up for.
Yeah, but we should have a no spoilers alert. No spoilers alert. You know, like Game of Thrones. You go on Game of Thrones and you go on Facebook. There's no spoiler alerts. You get killed if you have a spoiler alert in the hangout.
You watch Game of Thrones, man?
But then Game of Thrones is...
Matt, do you watch Game of Thrones?
I just want to say...
See it on Sunday and stuff?
Yeah, of course, yeah. You get the point. You mean...
Can we...
Further ahead, he says this, but we're not further ahead. We're at chapter 2.
Yeah, fair
enough. What
we're
saying is in chapter 2, he gives us no answers. He just assumes it as the simplest explanation.
But that's he does give an argument.
Usually the best.
I can't tell if anyone can hear me or not. Crappy. I'd add in really quick that there are more than 5 senses. For example, you have prior perception, your body is visually located to you. You have a sense of balance. You can sense temperature, or rather the temperature of your skin, not the object you're touching. You know, there's a little bit more than the 5 senses. I just wanted to say I think it's more useful to think of it as sense data than the 5 senses, because it can also more broadly include any weird feeling. Like, you know, if you get like a weird ache in your chest or a fuzzy feeling in like your stomach or something, it's not something you can quite
intuition that an argument is valid.
We've already said, we've all agreed that sense data is not physical. So to start talking about what happens in physical things like your stomach, or that's not what sense data has been talked about here. It's just whatever it is that's responsible for our for experience, not our experience, for experience. Say again.
I just want. You guys cut out a little bit.
You're breaking up. My sense data is not receiving you very well.
Yeah, you might.
How do you know he's breaking up, Matt?
You might want to refresh there,
Yeah, refresh, brother.
I'm on a phone. I don't think
you trust your sense data all the time. Everybody does.
Anyway, we're not.
Prima facie.
We're still saying, as far as I could get from the chapter, just to get back to it, he's not saying, as far as I can make out, that we don't assume it. And I don't think that's, that's may not be where he's going, or maybe he's going to doubt that later. But right now he's granting that if we say it's an assumption, then perhaps there are some arguments which could persuade us in one direction or another. And that might lead to something. And what that's going to lead to, I don't know, because I haven't gone past chapter 2. But as I can make out, he's saying, look, although it is simpler to assume that it is real, number one. And number two, this sense data that we receive, although, again, must be assumed, right? It's still simpler to assume that sense data comes from something real, which does have these properties which are universal. And so the simpler assumption, again, is to even on sense data is to say, that it's less to assume that it's a real world giving us this data than it is that we're inventing it.
I don't know why he's making such a big. I don't know why he's making such a big thing about simplicity. Simplicity doesn't get you to truth. It just gives you as a. It just gives you as a way to move forward, giving hypotheses which you can't separate with evidence. It doesn't get you to the truth.
Sure. I mean, again, I'm not, going to go against Russell on it, but I think, as someone else has pointed out, we might be leading somewhere. And I'm only at chapter 2, so I can't say where we're leading.
Well, so he says, he outlines, he says, thus every principle of simplicity urges us to adopt the natural view, that there really are objects other than ourselves and our sense data, which have an existence not dependent on our perceiving them. And then he admits straight up in one of the last paragraphs, the argument which has led us to this conclusion is doubtless less strong than we could wish. But it is typical of many philosophical arguments.
An assumption is not an argument.
Well, he's arguing that we're better off going ahead and assuming it because it's more simple.
That's not an argument. That's just saying, listen, we've got a hypothesis here. There's no way that we can reason to the right answer. So what we're going to do is we're not going to even bother looking at going for the right answer, the truth of the matter. We're going to invoke Occam's razor, and we're going to go. Yes. We're going to move forward with the explanation that provides that posits the less entities in trying to explain the hypothesis. But whether or not positing, I mean, let's take, for example, I don't want to go into transcendental idealism. That would be a simpler explanation because it doesn't involve positing physical entities. There's no physical entities on some views of that. So that's a simpler view. You still have consciousness, experience, sense data, but no physical beings. It's a simpler explanation.
We've got some transcendental here. Hold on. We want to move on. I want to move on here because now that you've mentioned transcendental idealism, I did my best to sort of give a soundbite in my review there, but we've got the real thing right here in the room. So
you see how I segue into that? I segue right into that.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much. What would I do without you? So I was hoping that one of them, Josh or Jack, could explain the view.
They don't exist.
Are either one of you actually here?
Well, I think the idea is that, Russell's in the grip of a kind of a Cartesian picture where it's possible that he could be wrong about whether there's really a world outside of experience. And I think on the transcendental idealist view, there isn't really the possibility of that happening, since what experience is experience of something. So, so that there are things in the world, and they have a way that they appear in experience. And so you couldn't have experience without there being something underlying experience on the Kantian view. But for whatever reason, Russell isn't going that route, and so I think he can't actually really solve the problem. He can just sort of try to make a probabilistic argument that, by appealing to Occam's razor or something, that that probably there is a world outside of our minds, that we can't really prove it.
And we don't know what that world is. Even if you grant there was a world out there, it doesn't necessarily need to be the world that we perceive by our senses. It could be some other world.
Yeah, I think his epistemology permits that, as far as I understand it.
He says, again, this is one of the more famous quotes from this chapter, is all knowledge we find must be built up upon our instinctive beliefs, and if these are rejected, nothing is left. But among our instinctive beliefs, some are much stronger than others, while many have, by habit and association, become entangled with other beliefs, not really instinctive, but falsely supposed to be part of what is believed instinctively. So he's saying that, so if we're going to have any pursuit of knowledge, we have to start at our quote-unquote seemings. So to give a good example, it seems to me to be the case that there are some valid arguments. That's a very strong seeming. I'm going to have to start, even if I want to make any kind of argument, I have to be able to recognize a valid argument. And so that I'm going to have to start from that instinctive belief. And if I throw that instinctive belief out, if I say, no, I can't be sure that any arguments are valid, well then you've rejected knowledge altogether. There's nothing to build.
But in doing that, reason to argue. You need to have an argument to reject arguments. And that would be using the very thing you're saying doesn't exist.
Well, but even arguments have premises, and so some arguments are going to have premises that are themselves not the conclusions of other arguments.
It's basically a foundationalist picture of justification.
And he'll go into correspondence theory of truth and
that no spoilers.
So,
but I think that's sort of another hangover of Cartesianism that gets him into trouble, because obviously somebody with different intuitions is just going to be starting from a different place, and he's not going to really have a way. He's going to be at a stalemate in a dispute with somebody like that, because all he really has to appeal to are intuitions.
That's right. And so he would say, go ahead.
I was just going to say, when we are sharing intuitions, we can go ahead and talk. But when someone has a different intuition, there's a real problem there. And so it makes me wonder, whether this whole thing in this second to last paragraph about one of the meager jobs of philosophy is to help you organize your instincts and throw out the ones that have become entangled and systematize them and that kind of thing. Is that really a good thing to be working on?
Yeah, I think so, because I mean, in epistemology, intuitionalism is an epistemology, and I value intuition as a way of knowing things, but with a caveat that I don't think is included in his work, and that is, if I have an intuition about thing, then I will go with that intuition as long as there is no defeater available to me for that intuition. So we go with our instincts unless we have a defeater to that, and then we reject our instinct and we go with the evidence.
That's a loose variation of the principle for nominal conservatism. I think that's exactly right.
Yes.
I think that's the way we really work.
I do too. And I also think that when we have intuitions, obviously we have conflicting intuitions with other people, but I don't think that leaves us in a stalemate. And I don't think Russell would say that either.
Why don't you think it leaves us in a stalemate?
Because if I have some conflicting intuition with some other mind, I know that there must be error somewhere. And if I have no more reason to suspect error in the other mind than my own, then reflective comparison necessarily reduces me to a state of neutrality. But if I have some reason to think that someone is making some mistake or is being influenced by some sort of distorting influence, so maybe someone is on acid, well, then our intuitions, just because they conflict, I now have a reason to believe that my intuitions are the ones that are right, and it's this other person making some mistake. If I don't have some reason like that, though, then I'm reduced to a state of neutrality.
Yeah,
hang on, Matt. Hold on, Matt. Jack was registered an objection there with his no. So I want to hear what Jack has to say.
The point is that if the disagreement lies over some premise which is supported merely by appeal to an intuition, right? There's no way within the terms of that dispute, right, to settle the question. If all you can do is appeal to intuition, somebody has a conflicting intuition from somebody else, right? It's not going to be a justifier for them to say, well, it seems to be true to me, right? Somebody says to me, it seems to be true to me that X, right? That's not going to carry any force whatsoever as a justifier for me, right? If my intuitions go the other way. So I don't think that appeals to intuition are in any way valuable in disputes unless people share those intuitions. And I think that's going to be a problem with, you know, this kind of latter-day Cartesianism.
The other thing I'd like to add too is, how are you able to conclude that someone's view of reality is distorted, such as, you know, someone's on acid or something, unless you already believe that your model of reality based on your intuitions is more correct? How can you distinguish the person on acid's intuition and model of reality from your own, as with reference to one being more correct than another?
So that's ultimately going to be a matter of judgment, in the sense that, you know, these people who have different intuitions with us may not be being misled by some distorting influence, or they may have been just as good at judging what the evidence gave them reasons to believe. In such case, these people would be our, you know, epistemic peers, so to speak. And so in that in that situation, it would leave us in a state of neutrality. You're right, we couldn't answer the question. But, you know, in some cases, no such claims are true.
Sure,
you know, we can often have reasons to believe that we are the person who's more likely to be getting things right. Our opinions could be based on better evidence. Who we disagree with may have early been less good in judging what evidence gave them reasons to believe, or they may have deceived themselves in some way.
Isn't that from a sort of top-down way instead of bottom-up? You're starting with sort of this conclusion that reality exists and that you can reason from it and that you can observe these sort of distorting influences in order to come back down to your foundation and say, yeah, my foundation is good.
Right.
And that's sort of ultimately we're going to see that raises problems, because those, you know, who a materialist persuasion just seems true to them, that, you know, things can't, you know, all mental activity needs to be explained in, you know, behavioral or neurophysiological terms. But then there's the idealist who says, it just seems to me that, you know, physical facts, material facts can't just be true in their own right, but they have to be, you know, the subject of possible experience or something. And so you're going to be left with these two intuitions are epistemic peers. And so this is what philosophy helps us see, is these difficulties. Maybe none of us are right. Maybe none of these beliefs are true because our questions don't have any answers.
But that's why I was saying that what I think Jack was saying about you can't resolve it just by intuition. That's why I think if you have intuition, only going with intuition, if there are no defeaters to that intuition, is a better way, because when you move to defeaters, if you have two people and they have conflicting intuitions about the same subject, and they're only holding that, if there's no defeaters to that, then you can get into the subject. You've got to have a conflict of intuition here. Well, what defeaters do you have for my intuition? And then you can debate and discuss the defeaters, which might be evidentiary, and then you can resolve the matter in an evidentiary way in regards to which intuition should be preferred on evidence.
But even defeaters appeal to intuition. So if someone says, I don't think that's an defeater.
No. I mean, defeaters aren't intuition. If I have an intuition, for example, that I have an intuition that, let's say, I have an intuition that if the universe had a beginning, then it had a cause. That's an intuition I have. And if someone comes along and says, well, yeah, I know you have that intuition here, but here's a defeater and they present me scientific evidence for an acausal universe, then that's a defeater that I have to engage with, which is evidentiary. That's not something intuitive that we're going with there. We're going with a a scientific presentation of what the world that we think we exist in is about. And I have to say, okay, so let me look at that. And if I find that to be persuasive, then I would give up my intuition, because I have. What's an intuition?
I find it persuasive, or I find it a piece of evidence, or I find it something that counts in favor. Or
that's not an intuition.
Of course it is.
That's going with your reasoning. Your reasoning is not an intuition.
Oh, sure it is.
No, definitely, I disagree with that. I don't think for a second that if I have a sound deductive argument in front of me with true premises in valid deductive form, I can have all the intuitions in the world I want, but it ain't going to change that argument.
Because you have the stronger intuition that the argument is valid.
No. Validity is something we can test. We can objectively look at whether an argument is valid or not.
So I can't go out in the world and use my 5 senses to determine that some argument is valid. There's no test.
That's because arguments are not about your 5 senses.
Exactly. They're about our intuitions.
They're not about intuition. They're about what's been formulated over however period of time that logic's going to be on, and saying, here is what's a valid argument. So a valid deductive argument, here's what the kind of forums that they would exist in, and they'll give you modus tollens and modus ponens, and you have that, and that's.
So here's a question: how do you know modus ponens is valid?
Through my basic beliefs, that
your intuitions. So you can't just say my basic beliefs, because the basic belief is the proposition that modus ponens is valid. I'm saying
a basic belief is not an intuition.
So I have no idea how you figure that.
Okay, well, a basic belief is something that you can't deny without using it. You deny it on pain of using it. So if I deny the general reliability of my memory, I'm using the very thing that I'm denying when I'm
Why
doing
shouldn't I do that?
Well, because it's a contradiction.
Well, so what? Are contradictions bad? Should I avoid contradictions? That's what I'm saying. So, like, just to say that a contradiction is bad, that's intuitive. That's an intuitive premise.
It's not. That's founded on the same basis as the valid deductive argument. It's founded on what happens. What happens if you accept a contradiction? The principle of explosion, for example. Everything becomes true. Everything becomes possible.
I have a question. So, are you reasoning using one of the laws of logic, the law of non-contradiction?
Yeah, the law of non-contradiction.
Is that what this is based? This is what you're using right now?
No, on what respect? I was arguing from that we can tell whether an argument is in valid form. We can look at an argument objectively, and anyone can look at an argument, and even if you have, let's say you've got conflicting intuitions about a causal over an acausal universe, and then someone comes along and says, hey, listen, here's an argument. Both parties, wait a minute, let me finish. Both parties, even though they have conflicting intuitions about the conclusion, they can still recognize an argument as being in a valid logical form, a valid deductive form.
What? I'm sorry. Sorry, I don't think I was quite clear. My bad. I'm referring to when you were talking about basic beliefs that you can't argue against without it.
Yeah, that's
not reliant upon contradiction.
Yeah, you can't. No, you can't. You can't use it. You can't deny it on pain of using it. So you're refuting yourself by saying, I deny the reliability of my memory. You're refuting that statement yourself because that's what you're using.
Okay, so chapter 2, if I may, then I believe Jack said that if we knew it was a shared intuition, that would change the status.
Why?
I'm
argumentum ad numerum or argumentum ad populum.
Well, it would just be something that didn't need to be discussed. That would be shared, and you could move on from there.
Yeah, we could share an illusion, yeah.
So, again, if everybody has that intuition, if everybody has to have that intuition, does that grant it any more validity, or let?
No.
Right. So
everybody could be wrong.
What was Jack saying like 10 minutes ago before you decided to take it in a new direction, Matt?
It wasn't a new direction. It was related to the topic we were discussing: intuition and deductive arguments.
It was, because it sounds as though Russell appeals to shared intuition.
Right, that's what I got from it. But more than just shared intuition, and necessarily shared intuition.
Beliefs are what he calls them.
Instinctive beliefs, yes.
That's what he calls them.
Thank you.
That is what
so that instinctive, that's an intuition. An instinct is an intuition.
Right. So if by necessity the instinctive belief is shared, does that not say anything about the instinctive belief other than it must not therefore be, or it's simpler, because that's his argument. It's simpler to assume this is real sense data, or the sense data is coming from a real source.
Only if you don't have stronger counter, or any defeaters to what your instinct did. If you've got a stronger counter to that, if you've got a defeater to your shared instinct, you should abandon your instinct, even if every other single person in the universe held to the same intuition.
He says philosophy should show us the hierarchy of our instinctive beliefs, beginning with those we hold most strongly, and presenting each as much isolated and as free from irrelevant additions as possible. And so that's what he's saying. We've got to start with our most basic intuitions, like the ones that some argument is valid. That's where we have to start. Mm-hmm. And as soon as we reject those, knowledge becomes impossible. The skeptic has won at that point.
Well, I was interested, Jack, in having you explain a little bit more about how you see Russell as stuck in the problems of adopting this Descartes style dualism, and what is it about transcendental idealism that makes it so that you can say there's something out there?
I don't think he's there.
I don't think he's
still muted.
I'm so glad, because I did try very hard to bring him back in.
Wouldn't he say something like, if you have an experience, it needs to be of something, so something must exist?
Right.
It's simpler.
Is that any good?
It's simpler to assume that something exists.
No, I mean that something exists is not an assumption. Something exists. That's a fact. That's a certain. That's the only one thing we can be certain of, that there is something.
Well,
because
really?
if there was no something, what's happening here?
Yeah, thinking. There's at least thinking going on.
Right, yeah. But calling thinking something, right?
Yeah, it is.
Seems to give it a brain.
Yeah, but we don't. When he's saying something, I don't think he means something physical. He's just.
No, I don't mean anything physical. No, I just mean something is going on here.
I could see how that could be.
Yeah. I'm just clarifying, really, just to make it clear.
Yeah, that's a good clarification.
So maybe when Jack comes back, we'll ask him to clarify those couple of questions. What's that?
Seems obvious. If you have an experience, then, I mean, you don't experience experience. You don't have an experience of experience. You have an experience of something. And whatever that something is, that would need to exist.
Right. I mean, I'm taking Russell's argument to be, as I kind of vaguely get it, to be that this intuition of, being backed up by it being the simpler explanation, is one of the necessary intuitions that we have to have. And so therefore we all, when we conceive of another mind in our mind, right, we are conceiving of all those properties, which include being able to have real sense data, which does correspond to the real sense data that I must be receiving. And therefore, they must also have the same assumption based upon the simplicity of receiving this sense data or explaining this sense data.
But a solipsist wouldn't agree with you there.
Of course not. And again, Russell says right at the beginning, he says that straight out, that yes, this is still going to be an assumption, but the assumption is best made because of these reasons.
But he's not given any reasons, any good reasons, just appealed to simplicity.
Which
Indeed.
is a reason. So
Which
he's saying that we don't have any good reasons to accept that there is no material world, because we have this problem of miracles and there's inexplicable things that would happen. But then this other view, one, it seems to be the case, and two, it's the simpler theory. That is a reason to accept this view that is not available on the other. So we have more reason to accept this phenomenally conservative view.
Those are only reasons. Those are only reasons to go with that.
Yeah.
Those aren't reasons to say this is the truth.
Correct.
Yes.
And we all share that intuition, and we all share that reason.
No, we don't. Transcendental idealists don't share that reasoning. Solipsists don't share that reasoning. We all don't share that reasoning. Anti-realists don't share that reasoning.
Sure. Okay, so his argument again, just to say, is that it's simpler to assume that this sense data is accounted for by some real data.
And if we're going to deny it, we need something that overcomes that. So simplicity, you're right, isn't some decisive reason. So if we're going to if we're going to have more reason to accept this other one, it's got to pull some explanatory weight, and that's where transcendental idealism comes in. This is an effort to give more explanatory weight to this view that there is no material world out there. So one of the common arguments, and Jack might be able to back me up on this, is that on this transcendental idealist view, there is no hard problem of consciousness. So by denying the material world, we remove a seemingly insoluble problem, and that the existence of a material world, the appearance of a material world, is just an illusion.
But yeah, possibly, but on transcendental idealism, my view is that would be a simpler view than going with the assumption about the reality of external physical world, because with that transcendental idealism, you have experience, you have something happening, you have everything going on there, but you don't have that entity, material things. So
you're making an argument there, and I totally get that, and I think that it's totally what we should be doing as philosophers. But we should set out to the side that this argument, the seemings in this argument, the premises that you're using in this argument, have to be more obvious to us than the seeming that there is this material world. If you want to make the case and say that we should change our minds and believe this.
What I was questioning was the argument from Russell seems to be about simplicity. This is a simpler way to go about things. But simplicity, at least in respect to Occam's razor, is you don't multiply entities beyond that which is necessary for your explanation. And with transcendental idealism versus realism posits more entities, physically existing material things, than would transcendental idealism. So on Occam's razor, transcendental idealism would be positing less entities to explain the same phenomena than would taking the view about external physical material reality. That's what I was saying.
No, I think that's totally great. I think that's a great way to approach these sorts of questions and challenge Russell and what he's doing. I was just trying to clarify what Russell was saying, because Russell could then retort to your argument and say, well, transcendental idealism might come with it this postulation of a mind of God, that we're all.
That's cool with me. I'm a theist.
Well, that's what. So I'm saying. So it may not be simple. So when you say that, well, we don't have to posit this material world, and so it's therefore simpler, that might not be the case, because you have to posit a God. So so I'm just saying it's not obvious right off the bat, once we put all the chips on the table, if we're just letting evidential chips fall where they may, it doesn't.
Yeah, I get what you're saying there, but there's 2 points to that. First of all, positing God would be positing the most simple explanation on theism, but not only that, Jack and the Pal Talkers are not, they're atheists as I understand them to be, so So they're atheists, transcendental idealists. So Russell couldn't say to them, well, wait a minute, there's baggage that's coming with that simpler view. You have to posit the mind of God. They would be saying, well, sorry, Mr. Russell, not for me.
Yep, and that's how the dialectic would go back and forth. And so then Jack would have to, Jack's the transcendental idealist, right?
I'm confused.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah. So well, look, like, no,
I thought that transcendental idealism
this extra entity as God.
I thought that transcendental idealism posited these sort of idea of two worlds, right? Your internal world and then
I wouldn't say it's two
world.
worlds. I think it's two different ways of considering an object. We can consider it as it appears to us in experience, and we can consider it as it exists apart from us in experience. But it's the same object in both cases. There's just sort of two different ways to conceive.
So does transcendental idealism posit the reality of material objects?
Well, it doesn't. I don't think on transcendental idealism a dispute between idealism versus materialism would be a meaningful one. It's saying that there are facts that, or there are objects that exist independently of how we experience them.
What are those objects? Are they material objects or?
No, it doesn't. On transcendental idealism, there isn't a way to give a positive account of the ontology of objects. That's considering an object as it exists apart from experience, and you're not able to do that on transcendental idealism. It's kind of like an anti-metaphysical picture.
Because what I was positing earlier was that it seems to me that transcendental idealism, when Russell's appealing to simplicity, that transcendental idealism would be simpler than realism to external physical reality, because transcendental idealism wouldn't be positing material physical objects as entities in the explanation, whereas realism to external physical objects would. Would that be correct or incorrect?
I'm not sure whether there's a clear metric of simpler hypotheses in this case that one could definitively say that, but I don't think a transcendental idealist would want to try to defend transcendental idealism by appealing to parsimony. I don't think that's not the kind of argument that Kant tries to give, as I understand it. He doesn't try to say you ought to adopt my picture because it's the simplest.
Yeah, but what I was thinking about as a response to chapter 2 of this book with Russell, where he is making an appeal to simplicity. He's basically saying, well, we should assume that there's a physical material reality out there because that's the simplest explanation. And I was thinking, well, maybe not. Maybe idealism is simpler in regards to not positing as many entities for explaining the same phenomena as does that. And that's what I was checking with you.
Oh, well, that could be true maybe on subjective idealism. But I don't really know why he thinks realism about the external world is simpler than idealism. But maybe Ben knows because he's read the book.
No spoilers.
I can't say it without spoiling.
No spoilers, please.
I've been dinged for it twice. I'm not gonna say anything.
Helena will kill you.
I don't think so. All right. Well, I think that we've discussed chapter 2 a lot, so I'm pretty much ready to close this hangout. I am kind of curious about something though from Jack. In the first hangout, you said that you had an argument against solipsism. Now, it also seemed like you maybe don't mean by solipsism what I think ordinarily we think of solipsism as being, but I sure would like to hear that. and it would make a great finale. So can you talk to us about that?
Well, what I was understanding solipsism to be was the idea that everything that exists is contained within experience. But I don't think that that's a coherent view, right? Because, for instance, if you posit a self, the self is not an object of experience, right? So you have to actually posit something external to experience to explain experience, I think. And that would be a refutation of solipsism. And if you didn't posit a self, it's not clear to me how there would be a fact of the matter about whether there was one experience or many experiences, right? So I don't think that I don't think we would necessarily say that the second case was solipsism, right? But I don't see really how there would be a fact of the matter about it unless you posited self, which would be something that was external to experience. I think the other point, though, is that in order to make sense of our experience, we can't actually do that without a distinction between what we intend and what happens to us, right? What we're assailed by, right? Because there's sort of like two types of experiences: the experiences we intend and the experiences we're assailed by. And so if we're going to have a notion of experiences we're assailed by, it seems to me that we're basically committed to positing that that there's something external to our mind which explains our experience. But that would be a refutation of solipsism. Now, I think maybe the solipsist could try to resist that by saying there isn't actually any explanation for our experiences. But I think if they said that, they'd basically be committed to some kind of total randomness. And I think if you had a view that everything was random, it's not really clear to me how you could have thoughts to begin with, right? You could maybe have experiences, but not have thoughts, right? But solipsism as a thesis, right? If you say, I affirm solipsism, right, that commits you to there being thoughts over and above experiences, right? But that would seem to be inconsistent. It's not clear to me how you could actually have thoughts without having, well, I mean, the argument can get kind of complicated, but one thing is, it seems to me you're going to need to appeal to certain normative considerations that are going to presuppose things like laws and so forth. And I don't think you could have that on total randomness, right? So I think you'd actually be committed to a self-refuting view.
And what if solipsism was described as just only one mind exists, and that's my mind, and that's what I experience. That is.
Yeah, I don't think you could refute. So what I would call other mind skepticism, right? I don't think that's incoherent, and I don't think that's refutable. So I don't. If that's what somebody means by solipsism is what I would call other mind skepticism, I don't claim to have an argument against that. But the more radical thesis that everything that exists is in one's mind, I don't think is actually a rationally tenable position.
Cool. Helena asked a question earlier from you, when you said that there must be, with experience, there must be something outside of it, and she was asking where you derive that from.
Well, so I think there's two issues. One has to do with phenomenal states, and so I think that's going to be related to the idea that our experiences, that the very idea of experience sort of has built into it a distinction between and experiences. We're assailed by, and so if you have that distinction, you're basically committed to positing something external to experience, which explains the experiences that assail you. So I think that's one issue. The other issue has to do with intentionality and agency. So I don't think you can, this would be hard to explain in a brief amount of time. The broad idea is that I don't think agency and intentionality can come apart. And so I don't think we can actually construct a coherent account of agency and intentionality that doesn't involve a distinction between a first person and a third person point of view. And so for there to be a third person point of view there that we could have on ourselves, we'd have to be able to have a third person point of view on the world. And so that would require that there was a world. So the basic idea is that agency and intentionality presuppose a kind of duality, that there's the self as it's seen from the perspective of agency, and there's the self as seen as a kind of objective thing. And I think once you sort of posit the idea of the self as an object, you're basically positing something external to the self. That's sort of the oversimplified idea.
What about the idea that when we talk about experience, we're always referring to an experience of something, and that demands that something's there to have an experience of. That without something to have an experience of, you would not have experience.
Yeah, that view is called content externalism, and I think that that's correct. That we couldn't actually have experience with something external, without something external to us that we are having experience of. But it's not something that can be defended in a short amount of time. It's actually a fairly complicated set of steps to establish that. Okay,
I'm going to end the hangout. I want to thank every single person on the panel. I hope you will come back. And this has been wonderful and short, which is good. So thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks for having me on.